rebels. Have you noticed the new trend in food marketing lately? No, I'm not referring to the vast varieties of organic fruits and vegetables. You know what I'm talking about, the stuff that's 30 to 50% more expensive than the regular old fruits and veggies. I'm not talking about GMOs or pesticides. Today I want us to focus on something known as the ugly fruit and vegetables movement. Increasingly, I think it is generally true across the board that consumers are more aware of how their food is produced, or they want to know more about how it's produced or where it came from, the manner in which it was grown. Craft beer geeks care about where the hops and the wheat and the barley were grown. Good quality beer made with great ingredients is one of the implicit value statements craft beer geeks hold on to. That's why I wanted to talk about the ugly fruit and vegetables movement. It matters to Saskatchewan. It matters to our economy and our farmers. It matters to our way of life. Have you heard of the ugly fruit and veggies movement? The primary premise, and I think this is how I interpret it, is food waste is a problem. Globally, it is generally understood that we have enough food to feed the world, but there are barriers to getting that food to the table. The ugly fruit and vegetable movement seems to suggest that if we simply ate ugly fruits and veggies, it would go a long way to freeing up the supply to feed the rest of the world. It kind of shames us as consumers for focusing on only the beautiful food as nutritious, playing into a sense of shame for us being shallow and vapid, that shame designed to get us to change our purchasing behaviors. But then a few weeks ago, I stumbled across a crop scientist named Dr. Sarah Tabor on Twitter. Her work is focused on food safety and crop science, and she has an insider's perspective when it comes to these sorts of issues. And to me, she kind of flipped the assumptions of the ugly fruit and veggie movement on its head. She was arguing food security is more complex than a feel-good marketing campaign. I wanted to bug her and ask her to unpack these assumptions and really explain what's going on and what we as consumers can do about it. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sorry about the long introduction.
No worries.
But before we get into ugly fruits and veg, I wanted to talk about beer.
Yeah.
So, because you're in the United States and you're a little farther away than me, we kind of said, hey, let's pick a favorite beer and bring it on to the show. So, how about you go first? What did you bring?
Perfect. I got, it's a Mocha Porter from Dirtbag Ales from Hope Mills, Hope Mills, North Carolina, which is a few miles south of us in Fayetteville. So, I like myself some dark porters, so I'm excited about this one. And I'm going to open it.
I love porters too. They're my favorite style.
Here we go. There we go. All right. We're going to talk about what it's like.
Yeah. What do you like about it?
No, I like dark porters, and it is it's a dark porter. So it's kind of got that kind of that really roasty, a little bit bitter thing going on. It's wintertime. We've been having really dark, cold, drizzly weather, so it kind of feels good to curl up with something dark.
Did you know that stouts and porters are considered to be a wintertime beer?
Makes sense, yeah. What do you got?
Well, today I brought something that is maybe a little bit closer to home for you since you're an American. I've got That's What I'm Talking About Rolled Oat Stout by Pearl Street Brewing in La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Okay.
I think this is my all-time favorite beer. I love everything about it. The way it's constructed in terms of flavor from start to finish. It's roasty yet creamy. Has a little bit of coffee and chocolate in there. It's just a treat. And it's something I look forward to every time I go home to visit my in-laws.
Nice. I can tell you're like a professional at talking about beer for a living. I'm like, it's dark. It sure is a porter.
It's the kind of beer I would say I would only want to share my limited supply with people who would really appreciate it, because I only get it once about every 2 years.
Oof, yeah. That's motivation.
And Pearl Street, they're fantastic. If you ever check them out online, their energy, their sense of spirit, and their love for craft beer is just amazing.
Yeah. We've had some really great experiences with the Dirtbag ales down here in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in Hope Mills. They have a farmer's market that's hosted there. They've been the site of a couple of our Pride events, and that's a pretty new thing. Like, we've only had a Pride organization around here for, I think, about a year and a half. So they've been really open about kind of coming forward and supporting that community, even though it's still kind of new and not really a huge like integrated part of the community yet. It's kind of new and scary for a lot of folks here, and Dirtbag Ales is not scared.
What is the craft beer scene like where you're from?
It's not bad. It's a big military town, so we have a lot of veteran-owned breweries, and they're very macho. They're pretty manly men. We do have one kind of closer in town that's like a dog-friendly brewery, so they brew beer there, and you can bring your dog, and they have beer and yoga, so that's kind of fun. It's an interesting scene. So
That's awesome. Do they feature anything unique or special to the region that people can't find anywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, they make their own brews in house. I don't know if there's really like a North Carolina style of beer, and maybe there is, and I've just missed it. And everyone in North Carolina listening right now is like, "What's wrong with her?" But it's kind of like your usual stuff. They've got like homebrewed stouts, porters, IPAs, like all kind of the normal craft brew stuff.
We recently had Chef Rob from Prairie Smoke and Spice. It's a barbecue joint. He did a North Carolina style pig for our birthday party this year.
Lucky.
Yeah, it had. He used it looked like a chain link fence to kind of press the pig down and pin it down so he could do it upright, and it was the best thing. He was peeling crackling off it. I was like, oh, I'm in heaven.
That's the way to do it. Yes, we get the barbecue down here, and it's fantastic. You get like a good beer to go with that. So good.
I'm jealous. North Carolina's on my bucket list for barbecue.
Yeah, well, if you like pulled pork with coleslaw on top of it, we're the place for you. It's a little controversial. I'm still undecided, but it sure is here.
I love it.
Amazing.
Chef Rob, he does apple cider vinegar slaw on top of the pork.
All right.
It's
Okay.
perfect.
Yeah, so you've had that experience. Good.
The barbecue scene has taken off here. It's not quite at the level of North Carolina, but maybe someday.
Yeah, I mean, it's good food. I did find out when I was working out in agriculture that most of the cabbage for the coleslaw for all of the South during a certain period of summer comes from like one farm up in Pennsylvania. So that was kind of interesting because in the South, it's too hot to grow cabbage for a big part of the year. And there's a bunch of farms that used to grow cabbage up there. But as food safety's become more of a thing, a bunch of them were just kind of like, that's it, I'm out. So there's really just kind of one farm doing it, and they own the market because they put themselves out there, and now they're the one supplier for like the entire coleslaw market.
That's interesting. So tell me a little bit about your background with food safety and crop science.
Right. So I first was working in crop science. I actually started out life in agriculture as a farm worker. Not like a migrant farm labor or anything, but just kind of like odd jobs. And detasseling corn, it's as far as farm jobs go, that one's really easy. Kind of moved up into some other stuff, wound up doing a lot of R&D, like field jobs. And wound up getting a doctorate because my husband was in grad school and I needed something to do. So I was like, hey, I like crop science. Let's do that. Became a veterinarian for crops. And I graduated in 2011, which was like the height of the recession, right? And nobody was hiring, even in crop science. Like in agriculture, they're like, oh, we need more people in crop science. We need more graduates. You graduate, crickets, right? So, so that was a fun experience. I wound up kind of starting my own consulting house because there were a lot of folks doing aquaponics and other new agricultural techniques that there weren't a lot of professionals really addressing yet. So I was new. I didn't have a whole lot of experience under my belt, but nobody has a lot of experience with that. So it was fine. And yeah, it was fine. And it wound up being that a lot of folks needed work in food safety because that's becoming more of a thing. And that's just a huge area of need in general because in fruits and vegetables, again, it's kind of new. So I kind of figured, hey, if we're going to do food safety and aquaponics, I should know how the food safety in general works. Let me go get trained on that. And then it turns out there's a huge deficit of trained people who can do food safety audits. So as soon as I got trained, it was like, off you go. So I wound up getting a lot of gigs with that. And so that's kind of been a lot of my exposure to like mainstream agriculture. Food safety auditing is almost like your really, really high-end migrant farm labor. You're going around all these different regions, seeing what they're up to during harvest, honestly learning a ton from farmers who really are running tight operations, and then kind of seeing the contrast between those tight operations and like the majority of the operations. So you learn some things about the talk about agriculture versus the reality. And I'd already kind of, again, been working in agriculture for a long time on the grunt and dirty jobs level. So I already kind of knew some of that stuff, but then you kind of kick it up a notch when you're going to that many places. And yeah, so that's kind of been my experience. And then when you're working in the food system that much and you hear the things people say about it, especially kind of like the hipster bougie sphere, you're like, you're like, some of this doesn't quite gel with what I'm seeing in person. So that's kind of like my weird situation. So in agriculture, I'm a bougie hipster. And in the bougie hipster world, it's like, ew, you do ungentrified farm labor? Gross. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from, I guess, like kind of a weird in-between spot between kind of the ag and the foodie worlds. So
I think that's an interesting intersection. I get that same sense of feeling from our producers and our ranchers who deeply care about the animals and deeply care about what they're putting into the soil, but there's this level of skepticism from consumers on the what you call the bougie side that really infuriates them because it's not necessarily science-based or information-based. It's emotionally driven, if that's a fair statement.
Oh, that's 100% a fair statement, yeah.
So where does this ugly fruit and veggie thing come from?
Right. Oh, man. Okay, so anytime you're talking about food, you know, speaking of that whole like hipster versus foodie thing, or excuse me, hipster versus farm thing, anytime you're talking about food, you really turn into a hall of mirrors really quickly because the vast majority of folks listening, you know, haven't been on farms. And so we're relying on all these people to tell us how it is on a farm. So you have your foodies and your restaurateurs saying one thing, and then you have the farmers saying, oh no, here's how it really works on a farm. And the thing is, a lot of farmers either misrepresent or they straight up lie too because they have businesses to run. So, so it's a hall of mirrors. We have a lot of frustration on both sides because there's misrepresentation happening on both sides. And that was, that was kind of the shocking thing about working in agriculture is we have this mythos of farmers as like honest tillers of the earth. And some of them are, but they're also normal people just like us, which means a lot of them are assholes just like us. So, and there's, you know, it's not healthy or good or appropriate to kind of have automatic scorn for folks just because of their job, but it's also not healthy, appropriate, or accurate to automatically worship people because of their jobs. So that was kind of my thing as an auditor was you have to go to the farm and you can't listen to what they're saying. You have to look at what they're doing. And as a consumer, you really can't do that because they're off in the middle of nowhere and you're in the city and there's really nothing you can do about that. And farmers probably aren't going to let you on their property anyway. So again, you really just kind of have this whole hall of mirrors effect. And that's something that I'm grappling with constantly in my work is, and as an auditor, you can't really rely on what people are telling you about themselves. You have to look at what they're doing. And I'll give you an example. There was an orchard once upon a time where, you know, there's a lot of water testing requirements if they're irrigating. If they're just using rainfall and no irrigation, then you don't have to test your water. So this farm is telling me, you know, oh yeah, we haven't irrigated all year. Like we just didn't do that this year. And we did have to check something with the irrigation system because of their pumps. We had to check that they worked. And so they go, oh, don't worry, our pumps work. You can tell they work because our water lines are full of water and they would only be full of water if they worked. And I'm like, they'd also only be full of water if you'd irrigated this year, which you've just been telling me you haven't done. So there's some bullshittery all around. I mean, that's humanity, right? So, so you'll just get little things all over the place. And often they'll kind of assemble into a bigger picture. So with that in mind, we're just kind of off to talk about the food waste bullshit today. So
yeah. Because I used to work at a grocery store, and I remember we'd throw away so much food, and I'm just like, this is food maybe we can't sell, but geez, it's still edible.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that grocery stores are actually kind of doing a lot to fix right now. Like it's a work in progress. But food banks historically have not been able to handle food that only had a few days left. They're like non-perishables only, please. So food banks have been changing to, okay, we got 3 pallets of milk jugs that have 3 days left on them. Okay, you got to turn that around really, really quick. And so food banks have really reformed their infrastructure to be able to deal with that. And so grocery stores are kind of starting to plug into that. But again, it's a work in progress. So that's a big part of what has been going on historically and what's continuing to change. So that's kind of a problem is when we talk about food waste like it's a static problem. In reality, we're just kind of at a snapshot in time when a lot of things are changing. So you're like, yeah, right now X% is getting thrown away. But if you don't understand the trends that is describing, then you're just kind of looking at this number and like feeling shocked. You don't know what that means. So that's with things like milk, meat, dairy, eggs. Those are often things that have a very finite shelf life that you have to turn around, but you have warning before they go bad. With produce, it's a little bit different because, it's not like it's in a jug. Like if a jug of milk goes bad, it's not going to seep all over the place. Probably it's just going to be bad inside the jug. But if fruit or vegetables go bad, there's mold, there's flies, and it spreads them to all other parts of that part of the store. So I think we kind of think of a produce section like it's a warehouse, and it's not. It's a showroom, right? We're dealing with highly perishable products, and when they go bad, they make everything else around them go bad. So you have to be really tight and on top of throwing stuff away before it starts to turn into mush.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'd call it the call.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something a lot of folks don't appreciate. And we can go in a little further into the very interesting role that produce sections play within the supermarket later, but we'll just talk about like the biological limitations of produce display right now. It has a shelf life. There's nothing you can do about that. And it's kind of interesting because the food movement is like, you must eat fresh produce. But at the same time, like fresh produce is the most, like it's the leakiest pipeline. Getting it from the farm to a consumer, this product is so prone to spoiling and going bad that it's like the leakiest possible pipeline. If we're talking like canned or frozen produce, you lose a lot less to waste because you're not having it in a showroom environment where it has to be like, you have to throw it out as soon as it starts going bad, right? So you have a very different situation. And I've definitely had times in my life, and we're kind of still in one, where, you can't, we weren't able to like go through all the produce that we'd bought in the time that we, before it went bad, just because of like our life was crazy. And so you think you're going to cook that night and then something happens, like something breaks and you can't. And that's very much a reality, especially when you're poor. And so that's a big challenge for people who don't have a lot of money and free time and resources to be able to utilize fresh produce like that. So we just switched to frozen vegetables and we were so much happier. Like we actually ate all the food that we bought. But according to the foodies, you're not supposed to do that. So that was interesting.
What are some of the assumptions that people make on the consumer side?
How do you mean?
Or what are you seeing? Like, what's driving trends now for consumers?
In terms of food waste, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so the biggest assumption that I'm seeing is that food waste is happening somewhere else. It's not us, it's somewhere else. And I just know it's those agribusiness and the packers. If you look at the statistics, and I'm drawing this from a nonprofit called REFED, that's REFED. So they identified where the food waste is happening, and very little of it is happening at the farm and the packing house and processing level. The vast majority of it is either in what they call consumer-facing businesses, so grocery stores and restaurants, or it's within consumers' own homes. So
how come there's no waste at the packing level or the farm level?
Because they're dealing with stuff in big enough amounts that you're like, oh, these tomatoes, we can't sell them. They're ugly. Let's turn them into ketchup. Let's turn them into salsa or sauce or spaghetti or something like that. When you're dealing with volumes of food that large, if something doesn't meet the specs for fresh produce, you can divert it into like canning or frozen or something like that. It's at the consumer-facing business, again, like groceries and restaurants, and in the consumer's home where we're not dealing with enough volume to be able to divert it to a better use. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you guys are saying like, hey, this is an ugly tomato, but I think you even said it. Let's not leave money on the table.
Yeah. Yeah, it's again, that's kind of, I think, one of the things that drives the agriculture people nuts is when bougies are like, oh, they're wasting all this food. And you're like, oh my God, that would be leaving so much money on the table. Are you insane? So, and there's a lot of, we can get more into this. There's a lot of different agricultural regions in the US, and they have different ways of, in Canada, I'm sure as well, they have different ways of dealing with their ugly produce. Those markets are most developed in California because they have so many produce farms out there. So they also have a lot of like processing infrastructure for turning stuff into sauce if it doesn't turn out. If you're talking to farms kind of further east, I think that's actually where you're seeing a lot of the panic about food waste from farms, because we don't have the processing infrastructure out there. And a lot of the produce farmers also are fairly new to it. They're either hipsters who came into it recently from a different profession, or they're like corn and soybean and cotton farmers who switched to produce because they're like, I need to make more money. But with things like cotton, corn, and soybeans, you just kind of sell it to a broker and they deal with it. With produce, there's actually different grades, and you need to figure out what you're going to do with your entire crop. And they're new to this and they don't realize that. So then all of a sudden they're like, oh shit, I have 3 tons of this stuff that didn't make grade, and the brokers didn't buy it because the brokers have no market for it. With a lot of farmers who are new to produce, it doesn't occur to them that dealing with their entire crop yield, including the stuff that's ugly, is their job to market because it's their business. And so as a result, like, they're used to someone else dealing with that for them, right? Because they're doing corn and cotton. So they'll just kind of freak out. And a lot of these farmers, because they're closer to urban markets, they have an audience. And so they just kind of, they'll start talking about this experience they're having where they weren't able to sell their product because they didn't plan ahead. And then it's somebody else's fault, and the world must fix this for me. And I think a lot of these ugly fruit entrepreneurs kind of saw this happening, and they're like, oh, I can save the world and also make some money for myself. Let me go around and act like this is the big problem with food waste, and I'm going to fix it for you. So I think that's where some of the disconnect is coming from. Like, we do have a lot of farmers who have a big food waste problem, and it really comes down to a lot of like failure to market appropriately. But because we have our head up farming's ass, we don't really see that as, oh, that's the farmer's job to take care of, and they should have taken care of it. So that's where I kind of come from. Like, I'm a little bit critical of how agriculture handles its problems. And I get a lot of flack for it, but I'm like, listen, dude, it's your business. It's nobody else's job to take care of you. And if you go through life thinking like it is, you're going to be very, very disappointed. So let's talk about maybe some better ways to deal with our own seconds on our farms instead of like waiting for another middleman to come and save us.
Well, are people receptive to your message? Is it working?
I've definitely got a lot of press inquiries after that thread went out. You'll also get a lot of angry hipsters who have kind of like, they've kind of hung their personal morality on like the virtues of the American family farmer. And so the idea of treating American family farmers like, oh, they're a business and they have responsibilities to themselves and it's not my responsibility, kind of like hits their moral center in a way that they weren't ready for. So that's kind of interesting to watch.
That reminds me of kind of what we're seeing with corporatization of farms in Saskatchewan. Kind of the end or the slow struggle of family farming. People don't want to hear that the family farm is coming to an end, but it's really shifting to big industrial operations who are professional. They have armies of crop scientists, and these are not small operations anymore. These guys are 10,000 plus acres.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear you say that, because that connects it to home, I think.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, you can't say that. So like, here's the thing is, especially when we're talking grain farming, right? And especially up in like northern US and Canadian prairie provinces, you're dealing with a very, very short crop window. So you're in essence trying to support an entire family or company or whatever for 12 months on a crop season that lasts maybe 3 to 4 months. Like, if you break it down like that, it sounds insane. It is insane. So we have a lot of cropland in the South that's very, very underutilized because we have a lack of human capital. And then we have people trying to make a go of it where there's no crop season. And you're like, this is messed up. Maybe we don't need to be farming these places, but we've decided that that's the right thing to do. So we're going to tie ourselves in knots trying to make it work. And it's completely verboten to talk about that. Like maybe it's a broken system. So that's really interesting to me.
One of the things I do remember hearing, Saskatchewan unto itself has a really unique soil structure that it helps produce some of the best crops in the world in regards to like pulses or wheat or barley. Maybe that's what's driving that a little bit.
Nah, I mean, it's really like I do a lot of soil science. And so it's really interesting to me when people say the soil is special. That's almost never what's really happening.
Okay.
Almost never.
You're blowing my mind. Tell me more. What's going on?
Yeah, there are a few cases where the dirt is special, and that's like really limited places. Like there's an area of the Everglades south of Lake Okeechobee where it's just like old swampland. Anytime you're dealing with drained swamp and you have like this black soil that's almost completely organic matter, you're basically farming in 100% compost. And that's really the one time when you have special dirt. You'll have times when you have dirts that are better for some crops than others. Like here in North Carolina, we have sand, and it's great for growing sweet potatoes because it's loose, and so you can just dig them up without having a whole lot of muss and fuss. Like with a clay soil, you get a lot of cracking, you get a lot of broken sweet potatoes, less with the sand. So that's less of a fertility issue and more just like it's loose and you can push it around. It's almost never about the soil. It's about something social. There's a book called, I'm looking at it right now, The Social History of Agriculture. And it's really interesting because we kind of have this mythos that we farm the way we farm because of the environment. In Asia, they grow rice because it's hot and wet and there's a lot of water. And in Idaho, we grow potatoes because it's cold and dry. In reality, nature offers us opportunities, but the reason we pursue them in the ways that we do is entirely social. So people think, for example, I'm going to go back to Asia. Immigrants from China are super disciplined because they come from cultures where they grow rice, and that's where like it teaches you to be disciplined. That's not what fucking happened.
What happened?
What really happened is, so you've heard of Sun Tzu's Art of War, right? That was a book that was written about 500 BC, in China. It was in a period where there were a bunch of different dynasties vying for the throne. It was kind of a Game of Thrones situation. And the dynasty that won was the one that was headed by a guy who was a peasant. And he realized that when you're trying to run a kingdom, you have, the royal family running the place, and then you have peasants, and then you have this whole like mishmash of nobles and landlords in the middle. And this guy who was a peasant, who got in charge of his dynasty, realized that landlords sucking the life out of peasants were what caused you to lose wars, because your peasants grow up hungry, they don't have as many kids, and your army falls apart. So in this particular situation, it was like, if I understand correctly, it was a long war of attrition. And so the dynasty that was able to support its peasants into like growing into adulthood and actually being able to fight in the army was the one that won. So as a result of this early political situation, China kind of realized the value of not letting landlords run amok and suck the life out of your peasants, right? And that was very early on in their history. So they have a lot of political science dedicated to this is how you keep your landlords in check. And obviously, like every era, China did not 100% live up to that, but that's not something that ever really happened in the West, for example. We had feudalism, we had the landlords running everything for like thousands of years. So when you have a culture that develops in kind of more like a Chinese situation where there's a reason to work, because if you invest in your land, you're actually going to be able to see some gain out of it. Then there's actually a point in trying to grow rice. Like it takes a lot of infrastructure. You have to have canals, dams, locks, pumps, all that stuff. And it has to be publicly maintained by a centralized government. You can't just have a little patchwork of landlords doing it. It has to be like a big network. So having that centralized government actually created the social conditions that it takes to grow rice. So it's not like, and I think this is kind of a stereotype anyway, but it's not like we have a culture that values discipline because they grow rice. They grow rice because they value discipline. So that was a really long way of going about it. But it's kind of, we have this myth of like the way we farm is like an expression of nature, and it's really not. It's an expression of how our society works.
What our society values, what our society believes. I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a huge vested interest in people believing it's about the earth and not looking at what the society is pushing us to do, isn't it?
What the hell are we doing?
I know. Yeah, so there's a lot of the things that we believe about agriculture are the result of, when settlers from Europe came to North America, they had to build a certain culture to kind of enable, number one, the theft of land, and then kind of persuading poor settlers that what they wanted to do with their lives was go out on a frontier where there was no infrastructure, no support. It was very unsafe. And the political, the economic potential in family farming is not actually that good. It's a terrible way to make a living. But they had to convince people it was a good idea in order to get them to do it, because rich people need someone to hold down the frontiers. So we have this culture of really worshiping family farmers because we needed to in order to support the rich people back east, right? So so that's really interesting to me. Yeah. So
have you been following what's going on locally in our neck of the woods?
Not a huge amount.
Socially, politically?
We're all kind of on fire with the soybeans thing down here.
It's interesting that you say these things, because I remember even my dad researching our own family, 4 generations back, were just poor farmers sent out west, convinced to go bust some sod. Mm-hmm. Were dirt poor, and now they couldn't make a go of it. They just struggled. They were dirt poor until they went into the city and got some other kind of job.
Yeah.
But we're grappling with a lot of issues around First Nations,
mm-hmm.
Treaty rights.
Yeah.
We live and exist on Treaty 5 lands. There's lots of stuff to unpack there. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to see you saying these things without necessarily knowing that we're grappling with those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a North America-wide phenomenon, right? And we're here in the South, like, a lot of things happen since native expulsion. So we have, like, layers and layers and layers on layers of stuff to deal with down here. Actually, the largest native community east of the Mississippi River is in the county south of us. So the place the beer is from is halfway between us and that. And a lot of how they hung on was just being in a swamp. And so nobody else wanted that land. And so now every time there's a hurricane, they get flooded out, and it's a mess. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of interesting to see how that's still unfolding today. But yeah, like a lot of North American culture was really kind of built to support this whole like culture of conquest, and the worship of family farmers is actually a really interesting part of that. So, as someone who loves agriculture, I love working outside, I love being with plants. I really love the practical approach to things that comes from agriculture. At the same time, there's a lot of crazy stuff in that culture that we don't need and is not practical. It's really just there to, again, we're in a military town, so I tell people it's a 400-year-old psyop. It's a psychological operation. It's marketing. It's geared to lead us into a mindset that's friendly to conquest and convinces us that it's a good idea. So, I'm like, how do we do agriculture in a way that's sane, that is sustainable, and doesn't do it in a way that like really disproportionately weights certain people over others, I guess is my question.
So what can consumers do? Let's tie it all back to the ugly fruit and veg movement. What can we do against these kinds of marketing campaigns?
The first thing is there's nothing inherently wrong with ugly fruit. Like if you're getting a box of ugly fruit every week and it's working out for you, like go at it, go nuts. That's how food distribution should work. It should work for your schedule and your routine and your life. And so if it's doing that, that's perfect. That's all it needs to do. I would say if it's not working out for you, don't get an ugly fruit box just because of guilt or because it's supposed to save the world. I kind of tell people it's like breweries or it's like beer, right? We do it because it's fun. We don't necessarily, maybe there's breweries out there that say they're doing it to save the world, but I think most of us are clear that we're just doing it because beer is fun. So, and that's
one
fine.
of our promises to try and say we're making the community a better place.
Yeah.
So we're mindful of where our products come from and what goes into them.
Yeah,
we're trying to mitigate wastewater, and one of the things we're working on is taking our spent grain and not just using it for composting, but turning into value-added food products like granola bars or dog treats.
Right, yeah. I was going to ask, because every brewery has a big waste stream of dried distillers grains. So, like, how's that going for you guys?
We're figuring it out. One of our big successes last year was doing composting, and we actually bought up a bunch of that soil, and we have it used around the brewery for peppers and hops and our own small garden that we run during the summer.
Ooh, fancy.
We're going to launch a small but limited line of Saskatchewan hot sauces. We're pretty excited.
Nice. That's exciting. Yeah, so it's kind of funny because, again, I work in agriculture, right? So I'm like, in terms of fixes, I'm like, okay, here's the industry scale fix. And people are like, no, what can I put in my shopping cart? So like, that's just not what I do, right? And a lot of my shtick is like, I think we've all kind of been trained, like Pavlov style, to believe that the way to fix things is with your shopping cart. But a lot of problems are bigger than our shopping cart. That said, let's see, according to Refed, so overall food waste, about 20% of it is farm and packing house. So that's like the big, the high volume waste streams that ugly fruit is supposed to fix. Only 20% of food waste actually comes from that. Whereas consumer facing businesses, again, groceries and restaurants, and consumer homes themselves are both about 40%. Like the homes are a little bit higher, it's like 43%, but they're about equal, right? So the things consumers can do, I mean, just eat what you buy, which sounds really simple, but it has a lot to do with, at least for us personally. Like when we buy produce, we don't put it in the fridge, we put it on the table so we can see it and we eat it. Because we found that putting stuff in the fridge, it would just get forgotten. And I mean, that may work for you.
It's that simple?
It does. It's not 100%, but we just kind of found like that was helpful for us, like, because we're just always looking for easy snacks. So if it's out there, we're like, ooh, yeah, eat it. So for different people, different things may work. We also switched to a lot of frozen vegetables, especially in times in our lives when we were crazy busy. And there's a lot of hoopla about how they don't have as many nutrients. That's mostly really overrated. It has a lot less nutrients than frozen food is food that went bad and you didn't eat it. So, so a lot of it's just kind of just figuring out what works for you. Like just kind of pay attention. Like if I throw something away, like what contributed to that? Why didn't I get to it? Is it going to help if I leave it on the table? If I schedule my meals, if I do meal prep, whatever works for you, because everybody has a different life. It's really about just paying attention to what works for you and just going with that. And it's a learning process that takes time.
Sorry, you're blowing my mind today.
I don't know. It's like pretty straightforward. Just there's no one size fits all solution. It's just finding ways to live your life that work. Restaurants are already kind of reducing portion sizes in general. Like the giant portions was kind of a 90s and aughts thing that's now out of fashion because it was super wasteful. There's a lot of food that just shouldn't be eaten, like things that have been in chafing dishes for too long. Like just don't try to recycle that into eating it. Just as a food safety person, please don't. There's a lot of things we can do with waste disposal. I really like biochar because that's a way to turn food waste into like a fertilizer that you can use. It's lightweight, it's easy to truck. So at least you're returning the nutrients to the soil so they can try again next year. And unlike certain other kinds of waste disposal, you can actually use like mixed waste. Like you can just throw your food waste in with your common household trash. It gets all collected and it goes into biochar because that can turn anything into char. It can turn plastic, food, old clothes, tires. It can turn it all into like a charcoal that you can use on soil. I don't know if that was like too much drunk scientist talk. Do you want to break that down? Do we need to do that?
I think that's fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to insert your contact information on Twitter into the show notes. So if people want to kind of see what projects you're working on or get more information from you, they can definitely follow up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just released a whole podcast episode on biochar, so yay.
So tell me a little bit about your podcast, just for the audience's sake.
Sure, yeah. It's called Farm to Tabor, and so far I've been putting out about one season a year, kind of in the off season. So in agriculture, you work spring through fall, and then in the winter or, early spring, it's podcast time. So that's been pretty fun. We just kind of talk about some things we've seen in agriculture, maybe some things that get a little misunderstood. kind of like we did on here. You know, there are some things that foodies misunderstand. I feel like there's also some things agriculture could do a little bit more to kind of understand about the markets. So we just kind of talk about that disconnect and how to kind of bring it together.
That's awesome. Sarah, I want to thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me know if you guys have any more questions, and this was super fun.
Definitely. Rebels, thanks for tuning in this week. If you want to find the latest news about Rebellion Brewing, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Untappd. I'm going to include links to Sarah's podcast and Sarah's Twitter in the show notes below. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.